Hey, welcome to Lessons from the Boot. I'm your host, Ms. Brittany, and every week I dive deep into the personal growth and development that living here in South Italy teaches me, in the hope that you can gain some inspiration from it wherever you may be in the world. In today's episode, I'm talking about the classic heart versus head pull that we often go through when we are facing a crossroads in our life. And this is essentially where I'm at right now. And I thought it would be really good to talk about it in today's podcast because I think we all experience this at some point in our lives. And it's also really interesting how your approach to this can change, especially when you're living in another country. I think for me personally, when I look back on my life in London, I was way more fearless when I lived in London. I was a police officer in the Met for 6 years, working in one of the most challenging boroughs in London, dealing with things that, oh my goodness, the average person will never deal with in their entire lifetime. And in a way, that's a really good thing. And I remember that it was a career that, is not easy to get into. There's a lot of studying that goes into becoming a police officer. You have exams that you have to take. You've got laws and legislation that you need to learn. Then there's, of course, the officer safety techniques that you have to know and the fitness tests that you need to pass. So there is a lot that goes into that kind of career. You don't just fill in an application form, have an interview and start the job. You spend months in training. And it was something that when I joined, I assumed would be my career for life, as most people do. The police is generally considered one of the safer options, one of the more secure options as a career, although I do feel that has changed ever so slightly in recent years because essentially anything could happen which could put you in danger of losing your job. So I do feel that maybe it's not as secure as it once was. But that said, I started that job and assumed it would be the career that would last for my life. And then 6 years in, I decided to quit and start my own business. Now, you might be thinking, wow, that's really brave. But surely in order to make that kind of decision, you must have had some kind of experience or, there was something solid behind that decision to inspire you to leave the police. But in reality, there wasn't. I wasn't an entrepreneur through experience. I didn't have anybody in my family who was an entrepreneur. I essentially taught myself from scratch the basics of running a business and how to be an entrepreneur. I didn't have anybody feed me a silver spoon and show me the ropes. And so in order to leave the police, which, a perceived career, guaranteed salary every month, to start something completely unknown with no guarantee of success or of anything was a really fearless thing to do. And I look back at that moment and I think, wow, I was so brave. And, boy, did it pay off for me. I had a really successful business and I was really, really happy with the journey that part of my life took me on, but also with the life skills that I had learned in the police, because I feel that they kind of carried over really nicely into the world of business and into life in general. But essentially, when I look back at that moment now, here in Italy, I'm like, I'm not nearly as fearless as I once was. And I don't know if this is an age thing, because obviously I'm a few years older now from when I made that big decision. But there's a huge part of me that doesn't think it is, primarily because I don't really view myself in terms of an age. I think age is nothing but a number, and essentially it's a mindset, because I see people who are in their 20s and 30s who are wasting their lives. And then I see people who are in their 60s and 70s who are absolutely living their life to the max. And so for me, age is nothing but a number. It is something that society tries to use to place limitations on people and on opportunities. but it's not something that has to define you. And so I don't think it is age that has made me a little more cautious when it comes to taking risks. I think it is because I'm not in my own country. And, when you're in your own country and you understand the bureaucracy, and I'm sure the bureaucracy is somewhat easier than it is here in Italy, and you speak the language, there are many things that make you feel more confident to take risks. But when you're living in a country which isn't your own, where the bureaucracy makes you pull your hair out, where things are not so black and white, and essentially where there is a lot resting on your ability to have everything in the right order because it isn't your country, then I feel it makes you that little bit more on edge when it comes to being brave and courageous and taking risks. And it's really interesting because I'm at this crossroads now, and this crossroads hasn't got anything to do with me wanting to leave Italy. I'm happy here. I feel like my journey here has, in effect, only just started, because I feel there's so much more that I'm meant to discover here. I'm meant to learn about myself and just do here in terms of projects that I want to do and passions that I want to follow. So it hasn't got anything to do with that, but it has got something to do with where I see my life going. Because I think for me personally, I have a very kind of open-minded approach to life. I see life from the end result. And what that means is that I don't really see life in the moment. Sometimes I don't look around me and be like, okay, this is where I am right now. I look ahead to when I'm like 70 or 80 years old, if I live to be that old. And I look back on my life and I think, would I want to be doing what I'm doing now if I were looking back on my life at 70 years old? Would I be telling myself something different? Would I be giving myself some different advice? And that's how I tend to approach life, because I think it's very easy to live life and make decisions in life based on our current situation. But what we forget is that moments in life are transitory. What you're going through at the moment will not necessarily be what you're going through 2 weeks from now, let alone 2 years from now. And so it's very tricky sometimes to make decisions based on where you're at in the moment. Sometimes you do have to step outside and look at the bigger picture. And that may mean looking ahead a few years and reflecting back on what it is that you want to have achieved by that point. And it's something that I definitely feel a pull between the head and the heart. The heart is romantic, right? The heart wants you to follow your dreams, is full of passion and makes you believe that anything is possible. And then you have your head, which is really practical, really pragmatic, looks at life in black and white, essentially is trying to protect you. And when you are at a crossroads or you're facing a big decision, you are always torn between the two. But I think that we need to spend more time listening inwards to our heart, because if we don't, we end up full of regrets in later life. And it's interesting because I've been watching some videos recently on YouTube, older people who are reflecting back on their life, and nearly all of them have spoken about regrets, things that they wish they'd done, attitudes that they wish they'd adopted. And so, if we don't listen inwards, that is the position that we end up in further down the road. And I do think that sometimes we can allow our external circumstances, the culture that we're living in, people around us, dampen our spirits somewhat or influence the choices that we make in life. Now, I feel that in the UK, there is definitely more of a progressive attitude. If you want to start your own business, for example, if you want to have a particular career, you feel that you are, generally speaking, more supported and encouraged to do that. However, here in Italy, here in South Italy, to be precise, it is somewhat different, because there is a sense of security that people yearn for here, and stability. And so people live to have an indeterminate work contract, which, if you don't know what that is, it is essentially a contract without an expiry date, something which is given as normal in the UK unless you apply for a fixed term position. But here in Italy, it's not. And so people live for that moment to have this indeterminate work contract. And even if that work contract isn't entirely accurate, even if the pay is abysmal, people accept it because it's a sense of security. And people sleep better at night knowing that they have something in black and white that guarantees their salary every month. And for most people, that is the way that they're happy to live their life. Maybe they don't fully enjoy their job, but they have a job. Maybe they don't get paid what they should be paid, but they receive money. Maybe their contract is full of inadequacies, but people accept it for what it is. But I guess I look at that and I think, how much do you value yourself if you put yourself in that position? If you work for a job that doesn't pay you what you're worth, if you have a contract that doesn't represent what you do or isn't respected by the employer, what does that say about you? How much do you value yourself in that moment if you're willing to accept what I would classify as breadcrumbs? And when you're older, are you going to look back at that period of your life where you had this job that maybe you didn't really enjoy, that you resented because you wanted to be doing something else? Are you going to look back at that period of your life and be grateful that you had this job and you had this indeterminate contract? Or are you going to look back at this period in your life and wish that you had been brave enough to take a different path? And I think this is where, you can easily be swayed by people around you. If you have this culture around you that is happy just to have this indeterminate contract and get paid the same amount of money for the rest of their life and, not really have any kind of promise of progression, then it can make you feel very frightened to take a different path. It can make you feel very anxious and maybe that, make you question whether what you want to do is really the right thing. So it's a very interesting concept, this heart versus head pull. And it's so interesting how you can be influenced by those around you and the culture and country that you're in. And so I kind of feel that there is a lot that you have to consider when you're at a crossroads. And there is a lot that you need to think about that could be at stake if you don't follow what it is that you want to do or you don't do what makes you happy. Essentially, if you wake up every day and you're living a life that isn't fulfilling, that doesn't enlighten you, that you resent in part because it isn't what you want to be doing, what toll is that having on your mental health? How does that make you feel? How is that making your body feel? Because we carry every single emotion in our body, both positive and negative. And this is why when people are particularly negative as a characteristic and as a person, they often end up with more ailments than somebody who is more positive because we carry everything in our bodies. And so if you are living a life just for security, but it's not one that fulfills you, how is that honestly making you feel? And I think these are the questions that we should be asking ourselves more when we're at a crossroads. How do we want to feel? What life do we want to lead? If we didn't have to worry about X, Y, and Z, how would our life look? How would it be different? And I think we need to try and find a balance between the protection that our brain craves and our head craves and the passion that our heart wants to follow, and try to find a way to have a plan, have a clever way of being able to do what it is that you want to do, but essentially doing what it is that you want to do and not talking about it and not putting it to one side to be forgotten until you're 80 years old and reflecting back on your life. And so this is where I'm at in this podcast. I'm talking myself through this as much as I'm sharing my thoughts with you, because I think we don't do this enough. We don't really explore why we're afraid to make decisions and why we're afraid to make changes. But I think where you are in the world shouldn't be a reason for you not to follow your dreams. Yes, bureaucracy in Italy makes me pull my hair out quite literally, and makes me just want to have everything in black and white, everything secure, and live a simple life so that I never have to deal with another government office in my life ever again. But the reality is, if I do that, I'm going against something that would bring me so much joy, and essentially is what I believe I'm meant to be doing. So this is it. Heart versus head. What do you do? Like, I think it's a personal choice. Everybody's different. Everybody has a certain level of risk that they feel comfortable taking in their lives. But the important thing is that you live your life without regret. And if it means doing things and they don't work out, at least you can say you tried. At least you can say you had that experience. At least you will never live a life being like, well, what if? Because I really think what ifs are worse than failure, because you never know with a what if. But with failure, at least you know. And so I guess this is my message to you today. If you're at a crossroads in your life and you're a bit like me at the moment, approaching the end of 2023, looking ahead to 2024 and reflecting on the past 12 months and thinking about what it is that you didn't quite manage to do and what it is that you want to do differently next year, I want to say to you, listen inwards more, not outwards, not externally, because that will always be a distraction, but listen inwards more, because I think we can learn a lot from listening into our passions, listening into what lights us up, listening into the things that we know deep down that we really want to be doing. And then I think it's just a case of making it happen, because essentially the things that make us stressed, the things that don't make us happy, in the grand scheme of things, a lot of the time they're insignificant, and they're an indicator that you've got to make a change in your life. Like, I think back to what I call forced upgrades, and I know that this is also known as well in the spiritual world, forced upgrades. And if you're not sure what a forced upgrade is, it is essentially the universe, God, whoever and whatever name you wish to attach to it, making what it is you want to happen. And it may not be in the way that you'd expected. You may even think that it's the worst thing in the world at the time, but it's always going to be for your best self and for your best experience. And I've got so many examples of this from my own life, even ones to do with a car. Like my first car in the UK, it was a Peugeot 206. And I remember that when I started my business, I needed a bigger car because I had a catering business. I had lots of things that I needed to take to bookings, and I just couldn't fit it all in my Peugeot anymore. And I thought about it, but of course I didn't take any action. And then one day when it was time to take my car to the garage for its annual service and MOT, they told me that there were a lot of things that I needed to have done to my car, which would end up being really, really expensive. And at that point, I realised that it was my forced upgrade moment. It was the time to get the bigger car that I'd wanted and needed. And I never looked back after that moment. And, it's the same with the police. I look back at that time in the police where I decided I wanted to leave, and it wasn't just a whim, but essentially there had been many things that had led me to that point, to that decision, primarily because at that time in the police there were lots of budget cuts, and the Home Secretary had put a freeze on police recruitment. So it meant that morale was really low, and police officers would be moved around to plug the staffing gaps because there physically was no money available to recruit new officers. And I just didn't enjoy my job anymore. And it was that ultimately led me to decide to leave the police and pursue my own passions and start my own business. And when I think back to that moment, I think, well, goodness, if that hadn't have happened, I would probably still be living in London and still be a police officer, because I didn't see at that point a different life for myself until things started to not be as I thought that they would be. And that's the power of this. And that's why sometimes you have to listen inwards more, and you have to listen to your gut. Your gut instinct never lies. It is the one thing that will always be your driving force. And so I guess this is my final message to you for today. If you're at a crossroads, listen inwards and trust the journey a little bit more. It might not look exactly as you'd have planned, but I promise you, for all the stops and starts that you might endure, for any discomfort that you might go through, it's all going to be worth it in the end, because it's far better to live a life where you suffer a bit of discomfort and sacrifice in order to be doing what it is that you truly love, than it is to live a life full of resentment and regret because you are doing something that is further from what you love than you had ever imagined. I'll see you in the next episode.